Santa Fe. The scripture passage that Betsy is going to read is from the 5th chapter of what is called Paul's letter to the Ephesians, except as I've shared before earlier this summer, it's not clear that Paul actually wrote this letter, and it wasn't really addressed to the people of Ephesus. But it's a letter that was addressed to the whole Christian church, all the various communities that stretched from northern Greece down to North Africa and as far east or far west as Italy and on into what is now modern-day Turkey. And it is a letter that is written to people who are living in a very difficult time, politically, economically, and also spiritually. They are living in the midst of the Roman Empire, where Caesar, no matter which Caesar it is, Julius or Augustus or any of the rest, Caesar is God. And you're reminded of that at every street corner, on your coins, and certainly in the ways that people are oppressed. And in the midst of that, the early Christian church is trying to be true to the one true God, trying to be true to a faith that overcame the hatred and division of this world, that overcame even death itself. Paul's letter, or whoever wrote it, to the Ephesians, to the early church, takes on that issue. How do you live faithfully under the Roman imperial flag, power, authority? How do you keep your soul and keep the faith alive? And throughout this summer, we've been exploring this actually fairly minor book. It's only 6 chapters long. Not only because it's the appointed epistle lesson for churches in the Christian tradition all across the city and all across the world, but also because Ephesians has such a way of speaking so directly to what's going on in our lives and in this world in this time. Because it raises the question of, to whom do we owe allegiance? To whom do we give our lives? To whom do we bend our knee? And what is our true worth derived from? Those are all topics and themes that we explored earlier in the summer, thanks to this letter to the Ephesians. Today, this passage is a very short one that talks about being the children of light in the midst of the forces of darkness. And actually today, we'd like to share with you not one, but 2 sacred texts. This one that Betsy will read from Paul's letter, or whoever's letter, to the early church, aka the Ephesians. But then also another prophecy, another piece of wisdom from another spiritual elder. But first, let's explore Ephesians.
A letter to the early churches. Therefore, be imitators of God as beloved children, and live in love as Christ loved us and gave himself up for us, a fragrant offering and sacrifice to God. For once you were darkness, but now in the Lord you are light. Live as children of light. For the fruit of the light is found in all that is good and right and true. Try to find out what is pleasing to the Lord. Take no part in the unfruitful works of darkness, but instead expose them. Word of God, word of life. Thanks be to God.
Grant us those gifts, O God, your wisdom, your mercy, your understanding, so that we might engage your word that comes to us through sacred texts, through sacred story, through all the ways you yearn to offer us your word and your presence. So grant us your wisdom, your spirit, your mercy, and let your word go deep into our lives so that ancient words and new words might give us new life. We pray in your name. Amen. The second sacred text that I invite us to consider is not from a Christian tradition. It is from the wisdom of our brothers and sisters known as the Hopi, the group of people who live on the high mesas of what is now called northeastern Arizona. The Hopi peoples have lived there for over 1,000 years in 12 villages on 3 tall mesas. But before we get to that sacred text, another story to introduce it. In the late 1980s, the University of New Mexico celebrated its 100th anniversary. And during that whole year, they invited big-name speakers from all over the country, indeed all over the world, to address a number of topics current at the time. One of those speakers was Dr. Martin Marty, who at that time was the head of the religion department at the University of Chicago, and also a world-renowned church historian. He was also at that time the editor and publisher of the Christian Century, which was, and continues to be, the primary journal for what used to be mainline Protestant, but also ecumenical understandings. Martin Marty was a big name, and he was talking about religious pluralism in that time. Now granted, that was 30 years ago, but religious pluralism had become a major issue both in this country as different peoples understood faith in different kinds of ways, and also had become an issue all around the world as formerly colonized peoples began to affirm who they truly were. It was also a rise of religious fundamentalism that was being manifested in a great deal of war and violence. And one of the things that Dr. Marty talked about, was the fact that fundamentalism is fundamentalism. Whether it's Christian or Jewish or Hindu or Buddhist, we all have a propensity to be able to slaughter one another over our religious beliefs. And so he was trying in his presentation, to talk about how do we live in this new global world? Because that was one of the challenges not only for UNM students and faculty, but for all the rest of us as well. At that time, I had been here as the new pastor for this congregation for just about a year. For those of you who may be new to the United Church of Santa Fe, this church was started in 1980 by the United Church of Christ, which is a denomination that traces its roots back primarily to the English Pilgrims and Puritans who came searching for religious freedom and then managed to deny it to other people, but there was at least a good history in there. And that's where our roots are, but this church is new, was very new. It was only 7 years old when I came. And so the first year I was here was when Dr. Marty was speaking that next fall. It was also the 1980s in Santa Fe, as in places like Santa Cruz, Santa Ana, Sedona, all the Santas around. It was the height of the harmonic convergence, the height of the New Age movement. And people were flocking to places like Santa Fe or Sedona to get in touch with all of this new special energy, with the vortexes and all kinds of things. They were also flocking to places like this and trying out. They may have grown up culturally Protestant or Catholic or Jewish, but they were coming to places like Santa Fe to rediscover themselves, and spiritually in every other way. And one of the things I was seeing at United was that here, that oftentimes we had people coming to United who had grown up in one particular tradition and then tried out a number of other traditions over the course of their young adulthood, and then sort of washed up on the shores of United because no religious tradition can take away the pain of being human. And in addition to that, there was also the challenge for a church like United Church of Santa Fe, with its roots in Northern European and New England Protestantism, to figure out how to do a new church start here in a land where people have been praying for a very long time, long before most of the ancestors of any of us in this room ever ventured to northern New Mexico. Hispanic Catholics have prayed in this land for over 400 years. As my good buddy, Monsignor Jerome Martinez, continually reminds me, his people were here in Santa Fe 10 years before my people touched on Plymouth Rock. And long before that, Native peoples, for hundreds, if not thousands of years, have prayed in this land. And so how do you take a tradition like the United Church of Christ and transplant it with some kind of authenticity in this very prayed-in land? That was really one of my questions. And to do it not in a triumphalist kind of way, but in a way that truly honored the spiritual setting that we were in, and also honored the strengths that a tradition like the United Church of Christ can offer. So I went down to hear Dr. Marty give me the answer to that. I was sitting in one of the huge lecture halls at UNM, way up in the very, very, very top. And at the end of his lecture, in which he did talk about the challenges of religious pluralism, there was a time for questions and answers. And being my shy self, I had my hand up immediately. This was my one shot to talk to a big guy like Dr. Martin Marty. And I said, my name is Talitha Arnold. I'm the new pastor for a new church start, 7 years old, for United Church of Christ in Santa Fe, New Mexico. In the mix of all those spiritual traditions, what advice do you have for me? He thought for a moment, down on the stage, then looked up and he said, United Church of Christ, you have the blood of the Puritans in you. I went, what in God's name am I going to, that's going to sell real well back at United. But he went on to say that the reason that what he meant was you represent a tradition. Your church represents a tradition of people who are willing to venture into new places, willing to entertain new ideas in order to be faithful in the context that they're in. That was actually very helpful to understand. And then he went on to say, Talitha, can I call you Talitha? You know it's a biblical name, don't you? I said, yes, I do. Talitha, you know that if you go deep enough into any spiritual tradition, you will find the common ground. But you have to go deep enough. You can't let people stay at the surface of any tradition. That's your congregation's work. They've got to go deep enough into this Christian tradition, this United Church of Christ, and all of its manifestations. And then they'll find the common ground with all the other people who've been praying in this land for a long time. Make them go deep. Dr. Marty's words have been a plumb line for this congregation ever since its very beginning, even long before I came as well. That was the same thing that Reverend Marty Baumer wanted to make sure when this church was founded, that it was deeply rooted in this tradition, deep enough so that then we can engage and understand and appreciate and learn from other traditions. That's one reason why for the last several weeks we've been exploring one little book of the Bible, 6 chapters of the letter of the Ephesians, so that we could go deep into what was really going on and not just stay on the surface. Because if you go deep enough, you find that these ancient texts speak to us today. And if we go deep enough, we do find the common ground. I was reminded of that earlier this week when I was trying to figure out what was one more sermon that I could wrest out of Paul's letter to the Ephesians. And I realized that Paul, as he closes up his words to the Ephesians and tells them that they live in a dark and a troubling and a challenging and difficult and hard time, and that they are called to be children of light, to walk in God's path in the light, and to resist the powers of oppression and evil and darkness. That what Paul was saying to that early church, those early churches 2,000 years ago, was identical to what the Hopi elder Tom Banyacya said 18 years ago, 40 years ago. Banyacya was a Hopi elder born in 1909 in Second Mesa, Arizona. He was deeply rooted in his Hopi tradition, so rooted in what it meant to be Hopi that when World War II came, and because being Hopi, the very word means peace, he refused to sign up for the draft. Not once, not twice, but 7 times. And so over the course of 7 years, he was in jail or prison more often than he was out. Because like Mennonites or Amish, Hopis do not and will not go to war or resort to violence. He was so deeply rooted in the Hopi wisdom and spiritual traditions that when in 1946 the Hopi elders of the time decided to break the vows of secrecy that they had had for so many years around Hopi sacred ways, traditions, and rituals, and choose 4 Hopi men to share that wisdom and share those prophecies with the wider world, Thomas was one of them. Any of you know anything at all about the Hopis is that they are a very close-knit and closed community. It's one way they've survived. They're a farming people. They have a deep connection to Mother Earth. And their rituals and their sacred traditions reconnect them on a regular basis to that sacred earth. But they see their rituals and their ceremonies not just for themselves, but when they gather, they are praying also for the restoration of right relationship for the rest of us with this sacred earth. But up until 1946, most of those ceremonies and traditions had been in absolute secrecy, not shared with anyone, and certainly not shared with the outside world. But in 1946, the elders at the time, in the wake of the devastation and power that was unleashed with the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the elders decided that it was time to take that wisdom out to the wider world. And Thomas was one of 4 men chosen to do that. When he died in 1999, over 50 years later, the New York Times obituary for him talked about the fact that he dedicated the next 50 years of his life to a basically thankless but tireless task of trying to share Hopi wisdom about how do you walk in God's light? How do we relate to one another? How do we relate to this good earth? All those things that Ephesians also talked about thousands of years before. That he took that message to the rest of the United States. He took it to indigenous peoples all around this world. And he also, finally, in 1992, after multiple attempts, took it to the United Nations. The story goes that as he stood at the podium, he first took corn pollen and sprinkled the podium before he gave his speech at the United Nations. A speech about getting back into right relationship with one another and with the rest of this good earth. Because if we don't, the dire predictions of the Hopi prophecies will come true. Banyacya is best known for a work called the Hopi Poem. You'll find it printed on the front cover of your bulletin. And I offer it to you today as the second sacred text. On Monday of this week, as I was trying to figure out what to do with this passage from Ephesians, I got an email from someone in the congregation sending me this poem out of the blue. And it's one of those things where one remembers what one has forgotten. Because I remember reading this poem in the 1990s when I was trying to figure out how to be the pastor at this church. Frederick Buechner, the writer, says coincidences are God's way of getting our attention. But listen to Banyacya's wisdom. You have been telling the people that this is the 11th hour. Now you must go and tell the people that this is the hour, and there are things to be considered. Where are you living? What are you doing? What are your relationships? Are you in the right relationship? Where is your water? Know your garden. It is time to speak your truth. There is a river flowing very fast, now very fast. It is so great and swift that there are those who will be afraid. They will try to hold on to the shores. They will feel they are being pulled apart and will suffer greatly. Understand that the river knows its destination. The elders say we must let go of the shore, push off into the middle of the river, keep our eyes open and our heads above water. And I can say, see who it is in there with you. Hold fast to them and celebrate. At this time in history, we are to take nothing personally, least of all ourselves. For the moment we do, our spiritual growth and journey will come to an end. The time of the lone wolf is over. Gather yourselves. Banish the word struggle from your attitude and vocabulary. All that we do now must be done in a sacred manner and in celebration. We are all about to go on a journey, and we are the ones we have been waiting for. Walk in God's light, Paul wrote to the early church 2,000 years ago in a land halfway around the world from the Hopi mesas. Walk in God's light and be the children of God's light. Two different sources of wisdom, but if you go deep enough, you find the same message. Now is the time. Now is the hour. And we are the ones we have been waiting for. It was true for the early Christian church. It is true for the Hopis. It is true for us here at the United Church. Thanks be to God. Amen.